For most of our riding lives, safety gear made a simple promise. You wear it, and when force shows up, it answers. That promise is no longer universal. Some modern airbag vests will not deploy if your payment status is not current, even though the sensors still detect the crash. That is not a rumor. That is how the system is designed. In this video, we are breaking down how protection turned into a subscription, where the final decision actually happens, and why this matters to the vest hanging in your garage right now. Stay with me, because once you see how this works, safety gear stops meaning what it used to. Safety that was supposed to be automatic. Protective gear earned trust the old way. You put it on, you forgot about it, and you rode. The promise was simple and physical. When something went wrong, the gear responded without hesitation, judgment, or permission. That expectation was never written in a brochure. It was learned through repetition, through miles, through quiet confidence built over years of use. The comfort came from certainty. Weight, stitching, materials, and fit all told the same story. Once worn, protection was assumed. It did not need updates, reminders, or attention. It existed to do one job, and it did that job without asking anything in return. That simplicity wasn't a limitation. It was the feature. Trust grew because the rules never changed. If force met the body, protection answered. No interpretation, no conditions. The relationship was honest. Gear never asked who you were or how you rode. It didn't measure behavior or judge intent. It simply stood between you and what came next. Over time, that consistency shaped habits. Gear stopped feeling like equipment and started feeling like insurance you carried on your back. You didn't check it before every ride because there was nothing to check. Once fastened, it faded into the background, exactly as intended. That confidence carried forward, quietly, until something shifted beneath it. When protection stopped being mechanical. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no line in the sand where protection suddenly became something else. It happened gradually, wrapped in progress, framed as improvement. Systems grew smarter, decisions grew more complex. Somewhere along the way, protection stopped being purely mechanical and became interpretive. Instead of reacting only to force, protection began reacting to patterns. Movement mattered, context mattered. Situations were no longer black or white. They became scenarios. That change sounded reasonable on the surface. After all, smarter decisions were supposed to mean better outcomes. But intelligence introduced distance. Control moved away from simple cause and effect and into layers that could not be seen. What once depended on physics now depended on judgment. Protection no longer answered immediately. That decision-making process was invisible to the person wearing the gear. There were no cues to indicate how those judgments were made or what thresholds mattered most. The rules lived somewhere else, beyond touch and beyond sight. With that shift came a new cost. When protection stopped being mechanical, visibility disappeared. You could no longer tell, just by looking or wearing, how protection would respond in every moment. And when visibility disappears, access becomes something that can be limited. If this breakdown is helping you see what's really happening, support the work by liking this video and subscribing. Share your own experience or perspective below, because rider stories expose patterns no spec sheet or marketing copy ever will do. How safety gear is framed at the point of sale. At the counter, safety gear is presented as reassurance. The language focuses on confidence, coverage, and peace of mind. What it does is emphasized. What it assumes is rarely discussed. The conversation stays comfortable, grounded in familiar promises that sound like the ones made for decades. Features are highlighted. Enhancements are mentioned. Words like optional and advanced float through the explanation, softening anything that might raise concern. Essential function is bundled together with add-ons, making it difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. Everything sounds supportive, nothing sounds conditional. Most buyers don't probe deeper, not because they are careless, but because nothing in their experience suggests a reason to. Safety gear has always been straightforward. You choose the size. You check the fit. You trust the rest. That pattern has held for so long it feels permanent. Details that matter live elsewhere. They sit outside the moment of purchase, removed from the urgency of decision. By the time they surface, the assumption of protection has already settled in. The cost here is subtle. It is incomplete understanding, formed not through deception, but through omission. And omission is easy to overlook when confidence feels earned. That silence explains why nobody went searching for a hidden condition. If you want fewer surprises in a crash, check the description. I've linked gear and accessories with clearer readiness and fewer hidden conditions. Why no one thought to question it. Experience breeds confidence, and confidence reduces suspicion. When something has worked reliably for years, questioning it feels unnecessary, even paranoid. Past reliability becomes proof, and proof becomes habit. That habit carries forward, untouched by changes happening out of sight. There was no warning sign strong enough to interrupt that pattern. Nothing felt different when the gear was worn, nothing demanded attention. Familiar weight, familiar feel, familiar routine. All signals suggested continuity, not change. Trust also came from identity. Protective gear was seen as a personal choice, not a system. It belonged to the rider, not to a process. Once purchased, it felt owned in the fullest sense of the word. Ownership implied permanence. Permanence implied certainty. That belief wasn't naive. It was earned through years of consistency. The problem wasn't ignorance. It was assumption. The assumption that the rules governing protection had remained the same, even as the world around them shifted. False confidence doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, built from yesterday's truths applied to today's conditions. By the time doubt appears, the belief is already ingrained. Confidence feels strongest right before it's tested, and that moment was still ahead. What modern airbag systems actually monitor. Modern airbag systems no longer rely on a single physical trigger. They observe motion in multiple directions, track changes in orientation, and compare patterns against expected behavior. Acceleration, deceleration, rotation, and position are all evaluated together. The system is constantly asking whether movement still fits within a normal riding envelope or has crossed into something else. Nothing happens instantly. Instead of reacting the moment force appears, the system evaluates a sequence. It looks at how fast conditions change, how sharply direction shifts, and whether those changes align with known crash profiles. The goal is precision. Avoid false activations. Avoid unnecessary deployments. Protection becomes selective. That selectivity introduces interpretation. The system does not simply respond to impact. It decides whether what is happening qualifies. That decision is made in fractions of a second, but it is still a decision, not a reflex. The airbag is no longer guaranteed to respond to force alone. It responds to a conclusion. For the person wearing the gear, none of this is visible. There is no indicator showing what the system believes is happening in real time. You move, the system watches, and judgment happens quietly in the background. The cost introduced here is dependence. Protection now depends on interpretation rather than certainty, which means interpretation is only part of the equation. What happens? When authorization is missing. In a crash scenario, the system still observes everything it was designed to observe. Sudden deceleration, abrupt rotation, loss of stability. Those signals are recognized. The difference lies in what happens after recognition. Detection does not automatically lead to response. When authorization is missing, the system may continue evaluating without executing the final action. It knows something has gone wrong, yet remains inactive. The airbag stays dormant, not because the crash went unnoticed, but because the conditions required for deployment were not met. This is the most critical moment. The body is already committed. Momentum has already taken over. There is no second chance for the system to reconsider. The window where protection matters most is measured in milliseconds. And once that window closes, nothing can be undone. From the outside, the failure looks identical to absence. There is no visible difference between a system that never detected a crash and one that detected it but could not respond. The outcome is the same: no inflation, no buffer, no added protection. The cost here is immediate and physical. Risk concentrates in the exact moment protection was expected to intervene, when timing matters most, and margins disappear. There is no buffer for delay, no recovery window, no opportunity for reconsideration. Momentum has already committed the body to consequences that cannot be negotiated away. In that instant, absence and failure look identical. What follows reveals that the system is not acting alone. Other conditions, states, and permissions influence outcomes, quietly shaping whether protection appears at all during the moment it is needed most, when trust was placed without question or visible confirmation beforehand. Why a phone became part of your safety gear. Modern airbag systems are no longer self-contained. They rely on external devices to manage status, settings, and verification. The phone becomes an extension of the gear, acting as the interface between the wearer and the system. Without it, visibility disappears. Apps handle updates. They confirm readiness. They display alerts and warnings that never appear on the vest itself. In many cases, they also act as the gatekeeper that determines whether the system is considered active. Connectivity is assumed. The presence of a charged phone with a stable connection becomes part of the safety chain. This introduces a new kind of fragility. Protection can be affected by things unrelated to writing: a dead battery, a failed update, a disconnected session. None of these involve speed, traffic, or skill, yet all of them can influence whether protection is available. The gear may feel the same when worn. Weight and fit do not change. The difference exists entirely in the background, where connectivity replaces certainty. The system assumes everything is in place unless told otherwise. The cost introduced is dependence on conditions outside the road, which turns protection into a conditional promise. When safety becomes conditional, safety has always implied consistency. Either it works or it does not. Conditional safety breaks that understanding. It introduces situations where protection is present in theory, but absent in practice. The gear is worn, yet protection is not guaranteed. A system that works sometimes forces the wearer to assume more than they can verify. You cannot feel authorization. You cannot see system state without checking elsewhere. Confidence becomes provisional, based on trust that all unseen conditions are satisfied. This uncertainty changes behavior. Riders may assume protection is active because it was active before. They may ride as though nothing has changed, unaware that circumstances have shifted. Conditional safety creates a gap between belief and reality. The contradiction is simple. Protection exists to remove doubt at the moment it is needed. When doubt remains, safety fails its core purpose. Even if the system performs perfectly under ideal conditions, the presence of conditions at all undermines certainty. The cost introduced here is the loss of reliability as a concept. Safety becomes situational rather than absolute, changing how confidence is formed and maintained over time. Trust no longer exists by default. It must be monitored, preserved, and periodically confirmed. That uncertainty reshapes where responsibility eventually settles, shifting it away from systems and toward individuals who believed protection was constant. Once reliability becomes conditional, accountability follows the same path, redefining expectations long after the initial promise has quietly dissolved. Why subscriptions exist in the first place? Subscriptions did not appear by accident. They solve a problem that manufacturers have faced for years. Selling a product once creates a single moment of revenue. After that, the relationship fades. Support costs remain, but income stops. Subscriptions reverse that imbalance by turning ownership into an ongoing exchange. From a business perspective, predictable income is stability. It smooths out slow seasons. It satisfies investors. It allows long-term planning without relying on new buyers every cycle. One steady payment over time can outweigh a single purchase, even if the product itself never changes. When safety becomes part of that model, its role shifts. Protection is no longer a finished good. It becomes a service that must be maintained. The language changes quietly. Instead of ownership, there is access. Instead of permanence, there is continuation. This reframing alters expectations. A service implies conditions. Conditions imply terms. Terms imply compliance. None of that feels unusual in entertainment, software, or convenience tools. The problem is not the model itself. The problem is where it has been applied. The cost introduced here is subtle, but significant. Safety stops being a constant and becomes something that exists within a contract. The moment protection depends on an agreement, it is no longer unconditional. That distinction matters, because services always come with terms. How responsibility quietly shifts. When safety is framed as a service, responsibility moves with it. Traditional protection fails, and the question is simple: did the gear work as intended? With services, failure triggers a different review. Were the conditions met? Were the requirements satisfied? Was the agreement upheld? User agreements exist to define that boundary. They outline expectations, responsibilities, and limitations. Buried within that language is a powerful shift. If protection does not function, the cause can be framed as non-compliance rather than malfunction. The language is careful. Words like eligibility, status, and proper use replace guarantees. Responsibility becomes conditional. If the system did not respond, it may not be because it failed, but because it was not obligated to act. This distinction matters in disputes. It matters in claims. It matters when accountability is questioned. What once fell on the manufacturer can be redirected toward the user through definitions and terms that are rarely read but always enforced. The cost introduced here is legal exposure. Protection that fails under defined conditions may not be considered failure at all, but reframed as misuse or lapse by contractual language. Responsibility slides away from systems and settles onto the individual through definitions few people read closely. That shift does not happen loudly or publicly. It happens quietly, reinforced by silence, footnotes, and unanswered questions. Over time, silence normalizes the idea that nothing went wrong, only that requirements were unmet. Legal framing replaces moral expectation, and accountability becomes something negotiated after harm rather than guaranteed before it occurs in real-world practice. If you want clear, rider-first investigations like this in your feed, subscribe to the channel. New breakdowns are coming that challenge assumptions, question manufacturers, and protect your wallet and safety before policies, prices, or designs change without warning again later. Why this isn't explained clearly. Clear explanations create hesitation. Hesitation slows sales. In markets where trust is assumed, clarity can feel like friction. The result is language that emphasizes benefits while softening boundaries. Nothing untrue is stated. Nothing complete is stated either. Sales incentives reward simplicity. The easier a product is to understand, the faster it moves. Detailed explanations about conditions, limitations, or ongoing obligations complicate the pitch. They invite questions that take time and risk uncertainty. Silence avoids that risk. Ambiguity serves multiple interests. Manufacturers reduce exposure, sellers close, deals faster. Responsibility becomes diffused across documentation instead of anchored in conversation. No single party appears deceptive, yet the full picture remains fragmented. This erosion of clarity affects consent. Buyers agree to terms they never fully confront, not because they are hidden, but because they are distant. Consent becomes procedural rather than informed. The cost introduced here is the erosion of understanding. Decisions are made with partial information. guided by familiarity rather than scrutiny or deliberate questioning. Trust quietly fills the gaps where explanation should live, smoothing over missing details and unresolved conditions. Over time, that comfort replaces inquiry. When clarity is absent, intent is revealed elsewhere, through design choices, silence, and consequences rather than statements. Those signals speak louder than brochures because they show what matters most when protection and responsibility shift. What design philosophy says without words. Design reflects priorities. Systems built for permanence assume failure will happen and prepare for it automatically. Systems built for conditions assume compliance and reward it. The difference is not technical, it is philosophical. Permanent readiness treats safety as a baseline. Conditional readiness treats it as a state. One approach removes judgment from critical moments. The other embeds judgment at the center of them. That choice shapes everything that follows. When compliance is assumed, design favors control. When failure is assumed, design favors response. Neither approach is inherently wrong in every context. The issue arises when protection shifts from one philosophy to the other without acknowledgement. The wearer experiences the result without seeing the reasoning. What feels like progress may actually be a redefinition of responsibility. Design choices decide who bears risk and when. The cost introduced here is the loss of a writer-first mindset, replaced by priorities that favor systems over people. Safety becomes optimized around processes, permissions, and maintenance states, rather than human need in critical moments. Readiness shifts from something trusted to something that must be constantly verified, preserved, and managed. That change alters the relationship between protection and confidence. This philosophical shift rarely stays isolated within one design or category. What begins in a single product tends to spread outward, carried by shared assumptions, copied frameworks, and accepted justifications, gradually redefining expectations until the original purpose of safety is no longer central. How this model is spreading. What began as a single approach has started appearing elsewhere. More protective equipment now relies on accounts, profiles, and ongoing validation. Readiness is no longer assumed at the moment of use. It is tracked, verified, and managed over time. Safety becomes something that lives inside an ecosystem, rather than inside the gear itself. This shift follows familiar patterns from other industries. Ownership gives way to access. Tools become services. Capability becomes something granted rather than possessed. Once that logic proves profitable, it rarely stays contained. It moves outward, carried by shared platforms and shared assumptions. As this model spreads, expectations change with it. People begin to accept that protection may be limited, paused, or altered depending on status. The idea of uninterrupted readiness starts to feel outdated, replaced by the notion that safety must be maintained like a subscription to anything else. The cost introduced here is normalization. When paywalled protection becomes common, it stops feeling controversial. What once would have raised immediate concern becomes another checkbox in a growing list of requirements. Normalization dulls scrutiny in ways that are difficult to notice while they are happening. Familiarity lowers resistance, turning once questioned ideas into background assumptions that rarely invite challenge. Over time, repeated exposure replaces evaluation, and convenience begins to feel like justification. Once that shift settles in, questioning the premise can seem unnecessary, even unreasonable, as if doubt itself is outdated. That quiet acceptance carries real weight because oversight has not moved at the same speed. Systems advance, expectations adjust, and habits form faster than rules can adapt, leaving gaps where accountability should exist and clarity quietly erodes over time. Why no one has stepped in yet. Rules around safety equipment focus on outcomes, not conditions. They measure impact reduction, coverage areas, and material performance. If a product meets those standards under test conditions, it passes. What happens outside that narrow window often goes unexamined. Activation logic lives in a gray space. It is neither clearly mechanical nor purely behavioral. As a result, it falls between categories regulators already understand. Testing confirms whether protection works when engaged, not whether it remains engaged under all circumstances. This creates blind spots. A system can meet every formal requirement and still behave unpredictably in real use. If the standards do not ask the question, the answer never appears in the evaluation. Regulatory processes also move slowly. By the time new frameworks are considered, practices may already be widespread. What feels new to the public may already feel established to the industry. The cost introduced here is systemic. Gaps in oversight allow assumptions to harden into norms long before anyone pauses to reconsider them or question their consequences. Once practices normalize, they gain protection through familiarity, not proof. Formal rules often trail real-world behavior, moving slower than markets, design, and incentives. When that lag widens, culture fills the vacuum. People respond with skepticism, informal standards, and shared warnings passed through conversation rather than regulation. Those responses are uneven, imperfect, and reactive, but they reflect lived experience. Over time, culture becomes the first line of defense when institutions fail to keep pace behind, where the line gets drawn. Acceptance has limits. Risk has always been part of riding, and that risk is understood. What breaks trust is not danger, but deception. When protection behaves differently than expected, confidence fractures. The response is rarely immediate. It begins as quiet discomfort. Conversations shift, questions surface. Trust erodes long before rejection becomes visible. Once doubt sets in, reassurance becomes harder to accept. Cultural lines are drawn through shared values, not regulations. Riders may accept mechanical failure, human error, and environmental uncertainty. What they resist is a system that appears to work, while silently withholding protection. The cost introduced here is a cultural divide. Manufacturers move toward control and compliance. Riders move toward skepticism and disengagement. That gap widens as communication fails to bridge it. Trust, once lost, does not return easily. It is replaced first by caution, then by judgment that hardens over time. Products are no longer evaluated only by what they promise, but by what they quietly assume about the person using them. Expectations shift. Patience shortens. Skepticism becomes a habit rather than a reaction. Judgment does not stay abstract for long because it eventually turns into decisions, conversations, and refusals. People remember how confidence was broken, and that memory reshapes future choices, loyalty, and tolerance for explanation, reassurance, or correction long after the original issue fades from view and collective memory. What awareness actually looks like. Awareness does not require instructions. It does not demand rules or recommendations. It begins with clarity. Understanding how systems are framed matters more than memorizing how they work. Awareness changes questions. Instead of asking what a product does, attention shifts to what it depends on. Instead of assuming readiness, people look for conditions. The focus moves from features to frameworks. This shift carries a cost. Innocence is lost. The comfort of unquestioned trust disappears. In its place comes discernment. That clarity may feel heavier, but it is also more honest. Awareness does not eliminate risk. It reassigns responsibility for understanding it. The goal is not to reject technology or retreat from progress. It is to recognize when definitions quietly change. The final cost introduced is permanent. Once awareness exists, it cannot be undone, and future decisions bend around it even when convenience tempts otherwise. Resolution does not promise certainty or comfort. It simply sharpens judgment. It changes the questions asked before trust is granted and before assumptions settle in. protection is no longer taken at face value, but examined for conditions, limits, and quiet dependencies. That clarity carries weight, yet it restores agency. Safety was never meant to negotiate or remind. It was meant to answer force with response. When protection depends on anything else, the contract has already changed. If this changed how you look at your own gear, do not let it end here. Check what your vest actually depends on, and decide what kind of protection you want riding with you. Share your experience in the comments, especially if you have seen a system fail or surprise you. If you value rider-first breakdowns like this, like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the next video. We will keep pulling apart designs, contracts, and quiet assumptions because safety should answer force, not invoices today.